have your attention, please. We're about ready to start. If you have an order, you should do so right now. Okay. I'd like to welcome you all to our third in a series of Tapped In. I want to thank you for coming. This program is called The Big Picture. And before we begin, we're going to draw the winner for the door prize.
You have to read the number. Oh, do you have to see it?
8311823.
Do I have to do it again? Sorry.
8311823.
There you go. So there's a $10 gift certificate. Yep. Thank you.
That won $10. Congratulations, Jack. Thank you. Okay, now we are ready to start. I'm going to open with a prayer from Mother Teresa. Lord Jesus, we want to imitate you, who told us, I am meek and humble of heart. We ask you that day by day, you lead us in this path. We wish to bring you, dear Christ, to others in your freedom, in your liberation. Help us overcome our impatience, our anger, our tendency to manipulate others. Help us daily to cultivate meekness, humility, and nonviolence. Amen. Amen. Before we actually begin with our speaker, Father Nate, I would like to explain a procedure that we've developed over all of the sessions that we've had here. If you would like to ask the speaker a question, please raise your hand, wait for someone to run the microphone over to you, speak loud and clear so that your question can be heard, and then we are not only wanting to hear it, but on the video, we want to be sure that it's heard there. So please follow this procedure, and it benefits everyone. Let's welcome Father Nate Edquist, but before we begin his presentation of the government hierarchy of the church, I would like to read a short bio that he's prepared for us so that we can become familiar with his life journey so far. So this is what I received, and it's in the first person. I am the sixth of 7 children. I was born and raised in LaPorte. After attending St. Joseph Elementary and LaPorte High School, I left to study at Indiana University in Bloomington, where I eventually received the call to enter the seminary. I transferred into Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit and graduated with a bachelor's degree in philosophy. I then attended Mundelein Seminary in Illinois and graduated in May with a Master's of Divinity and a Baccalaureate in Sacred Theology. On May 20th, 2017, I was ordained a priest in Gary and was assigned to St. Patrick's Church in Chesterton, where I currently serve as associate pastor. My hobbies include sports and lots of coffee. And now I would like to present to you Father Nate Edquist.
Well, I had lots of coffee before I came here. Believe me, I needed it. I was struggling this afternoon. As Sandy said, my name is Father Nate Edquist, and I thank you all for coming out here to listen to this. It seems like it's a very good turnout. I was expecting about maybe 15, 20 people, but unfortunately more came to listen. Now, I'm not sure exactly how I got asked to give this talk. I'm sure I'm making up some things as we go along, but I hope that you're able to take something away from this talk that you didn't know already before coming here. Now, I know that's a pretty low standard for me, but that's my goal. I just want to, since we're talking about the government and hierarchy of the church, I want to open right now with a quote from a well-known Catholic in the past, Hilaire Belloc. So this is what he said. After years of study, I've come to reluctantly accept that the Roman Catholic Church must be divine, because no merely human institution governed by such imbecility could have survived a fortnight. And how true that is, especially only after 5 months of being a priest, I can tell you that that is in fact a fact. And I'm part of it too, so I'm part to blame as well. Now, I'd like to give you a short little outline for this talk at the beginning. First, I'm going to lay out the early structure of the church and its development over time, what the leadership looked like over time. Then I'll go into the current structures of the church that we have, especially the diocesan structure, the local structure, as well as the universal structure that we see from our Roman Catholic Church that is centered in Rome at the Vatican. Finally, I'll go into the question that everyone has been asking me over the years: how do you become Pope? So I hope that that gets a little interesting. Now, before we begin with a prayer, I want to give you a couple of visual aids just to think about as we go along with this talk. And you can reflect on these as we consider church structure. Now, I have 2 visual aids here. So the first one, as you can see, is the pyramid structure, a very top-down model of any organization. You have someone at the top, and it's a trickle-down effect. Now, the second image that you see is a wheel. Now, this might be a little strange, especially when you talk about church authority. We don't necessarily think of it as a wheel. We think of it as a pyramid of authority. But this might affect your understanding of the church as this talk goes along. So just keep these 2 images in your mind as we... Is that good? Okay. Just keep these 2 images in mind as we progress this evening. I'd like to begin with a reading from the letter of St. Ignatius of Antioch to the Trailians. This is what St. Ignatius wrote around the year 100. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. When you are subject to the bishop as to Jesus Christ, it is evident to me that you are living not in accordance with human standards, but in accordance with Jesus Christ, who died for us in order that by believing in his death, you might escape death. It is essential, therefore, that you continue your current practice and do nothing without the bishop, but be subject also to the council of presbyters as to the apostles of Jesus Christ, our hope, in whom we shall be found if we so live. Furthermore, it is necessary that those who are deacons of the mysteries of Jesus Christ please everyone in every respect. For they are not merely deacons of food and drink, but ministers of God's church. Therefore, they must avoid criticisms as though it were fire. Similarly, let everyone respect the deacons as Jesus Christ, just as they should respect the bishop, who is a model of the Father, and the presbyters as God's council, and as the band of the apostles. Without these, no group can be called a church. Lord, as we reflect on this evening on the gift of the church that you have given us, we ask you to open our minds and hearts in gratitude for this teaching and authority that has been handed down to us from the apostles. Help us to support our leaders in the church as they carry out the gospel message. Grant them fervor in their ministry. And grant us all an evangelical spirit that reaches out to all people in charity. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Now, as I said, that letter from St. Ignatius of Antioch was written around the year 100. Now Ignatius, whose feast day was yesterday, was a disciple of the apostle St. John, who was an apostle of Jesus Christ himself. So he would have received a whole lot of instruction about the faith in these early years of the church. We see in this letter that was only about 70 years written after the resurrection of Christ. Unlike many of the other early writers who based their rationale of the bishop's authority on the apostolic succession, this bishop passed on his succession to the next one, and it can be traced back to the apostles. St. Ignatius gives a more theological approach. So the bishop of a church is compared to God the Father. The deacons are considered like Jesus Christ himself, and the council of presbyters, or priests, is compared to the college of apostles. You already see this early on effort to structure the church. Now, a few years prior to Ignatius, and only about 20 years after the resurrection of Christ, about after the year 50, St. Paul had laid out the qualifications in order to be a leader in the church. If you remember from St. Paul's letters, a bishop needed to not be a drunkard, right? Pretty high standards there, right? He shouldn't be a recent convert, and he may be married only once. Now, things have changed a little bit, but that's how it was early on in the church. There was already qualifications for each of these positions laid out by St. Paul. Now, the word bishop in Greek is episkopos. In Latin, it's episkopus. So it means to oversee. To oversee something, to preside at something, one who is in charge. Now, the early church, the bishop would be the one who presided at Sunday liturgies. So all the Christians in a community would gather together, perhaps in someone's house, because you couldn't have public worship, and they would gather around the bishop, they would gather around the presbyters, who were the priests, they would gather around the deacons, and they would have one liturgy, one Sunday Mass. Now, can you imagine that for a second? I can't, because I have 8 Sunday Masses every Sunday at my parish that we get to do. So, you didn't have all of these Masses, so if you missed that one, then sorry, you're really out of luck. Now, the bishop would preside, and the deacons would often be the ones to take communion, take what was offered to those who were absent, to those who were sick, those who couldn't be there with them at the liturgy. So these offices, we still have a lot of the vestiges of these early offices that have been passed down to us. Not a whole lot has changed. Now, on the outside, a lot of it has, but the basic structure has not changed over these 2,000 years. Now, there was a great sense of community in these early Christian communities. But as the faith grew more, you had more of a need for presbyters or priests under the authority of the bishop. Now, the presbyters would serve as the bishop's delegates, so the bishop would often send them out to preside at liturgy. But as you heard from St. Ignatius, do nothing apart from the bishop. The bishop is the one in charge. So the authority of the presbyters ultimately comes from the bishop. The ministry of them and the ministry of deacons ultimately comes from the bishop, as we see here. Even the marriages that were performed had to be approved by the bishop. Now, not all of our marriages have to be approved by the bishop, but they do have to be approved by the priests, the pastors of the parishes that they're going to be performed in. As with all of the sacraments, they have to be approved. And ultimately, all of that authority comes from the bishop himself. So from the earliest days, the church had a lot of structure. The church was not a charismatic movement, because in a charismatic movement, there's not really any organizational structure. You are acting according to the movements of the Spirit. But as we can see, the church needed that structure early on. Of course, it was guided by the Holy Spirit, but it needed organizational structure from these earliest days. Now, in the first 3 centuries after Christ, Christianity was still, in a large part, an underground faith. You had these offices, these structures in the church, but because of persecutions against Christians, communities had to gather in homes, or if you were in Rome, you would sometimes gather in the catacombs. where they buried the dead. And then the little children would be out playing, or acting as if they were playing, and if they saw Roman soldiers passing by, they would have to run down to the catacombs and tell everybody, there's people coming, stop the liturgy. So people often lived in fear, especially where persecution was. Now, these Christian communities remained small, and they were very often autonomous. So each bishop had authority over his own community. But that doesn't mean that they were cut off from the wider church. We have many letters written from one church to another about how to govern the church. For example, we have St. Paul himself at the very beginning. And then you have St. Clement of Rome writing at the end of the 1st century, telling the Corinthians, this is how you're supposed to act. You have St. Ignatius of Antioch, you have St. Polycarp, St. Justin, St. Irenaeus, St. Cyprian, and many others who are addressing other churches, sending letters saying, this is how you're supposed to govern yourself. So there was collaboration, even though each bishop had its own authority over his own diocese, you might say, there was a little bit of collaboration. Some would ask questions and they would seek answers from that. Now there were a lot of disputes in the early church. Some of them were practical and some of them were theological. And we begin to see this process of referring to the church in Rome. So there isn't a set pope, right? Jesus didn't say to Peter, okay, you're going to be the first pope, and you're just going to be in charge of everyone throughout the whole church. Now, in a way, I give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, yes. But the office of pope kind of arose a little bit more precisely because you saw this deference to the church in Rome. All of these other churches in Christendom would have these questions. And so they would say, we can't figure out the answer to this question. Let's ask the Bishop of Rome. Let's ask the church. Maybe they have the answer. Probably because that's where Peter and Paul, the two foremost apostles, were killed, was Rome. And so they are essentially having Rome built on these apostolic foundations of these two great apostles. So often the perspective was, you have a question, take it to Rome. And that's how disputes were solved. When the Bishop of Rome spoke, everyone took that as authoritative. And that's why St. Ambrose would eventually say, Roma locuta est, causa finita est, which means Rome has spoken, case closed. How many of you have ever heard that before? So when the Pope speaks, case closed. Now, after the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in the year 313 AD, you begin to see these communities getting bigger. They're starting to have more public worship. They didn't have to be these underground communities that, out of fear of persecution, had to do everything underground. But now they are becoming more public, and the church is becoming more universal, more connected, and is an unfortunate side effect of that at times is because when you become more public, you tend to become more political. And so that's how it often was early in the church. You had to have a stake necessarily in your seat. So if you were a bishop and you were in sort of a little small diocese like Gary, you're thinking, okay, I want to have more authority. I want to have more influence. So I'm going to try to establish my authority more with others. So there came to be 5 main patriarchal sees that were basically establishing their own authority based on their apostolic succession. So these were Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. Now what do all 5 of those have in common? Or at least almost all 5. They were founded on the apostles who went there and died there. The early Christians had a great admiration for the apostles and the martyrs who gave up their lives. And so they based a lot of their jurisdiction on, this is where Peter and Paul died. We're in Rome. We're the church with the most authority. Okay? Now, as I said, unfortunately, it became very political. And often the emperor who was in Constantinople would side with whatever bishop it was. So if there was a theological issue, for instance, like Mary, or what is the nature of Jesus Christ, there were these theological disputes. Not that everyone disagreed on everything, but it took some time for the church to understand its teachings. Unfortunately, it often became very political, and the emperor would get involved, and things would sometimes go south there. So it wasn't just the bishops arguing, it would be the emperor, and if he didn't like someone, he would have them deposed or thrown in prison or killed or whoever it was. So it got pretty ugly sometimes in the early church. Now, last week, at my parish, we had a little discussion with one of the teachers who is here, and we were in the parking lot of the school, and one of the teachers said, "Oh, so the structure of the church is very political, right?" And so my pastor said, "No, it's all the working of the Holy Spirit. There's nothing political about it." Now, we had to laugh pretty hard about that one, because we like to think that the church doesn't work in a non-political way. But as I said, the church isn't a charismatic movement. It doesn't simply work along with the movements of the Holy Spirit and not rely on these hierarchical structures. It needs organization. So anytime you have an organization, it has sort of a stake in the political life, the social life, the civic life of whatever society that you're based in. Now, sometimes our human personalities get in the way of the working of the Holy Spirit. And I only have 45 minutes, so I can't name off all of the ways that our human personalities have gotten in the way throughout the history of the church. But hopefully our motives are those of faith and not of political gain or money or power or anything like that. Now, as time went on in the church, more and more structure came about. The office of Pope came to be more highly recognized, to where the height of papal authority came eventually in about the 13th century, where you would have popes putting whole nations under interdict. So if he got in a dispute with some king, and the king kind of ticked off the pope would put them under interdict, meaning no sacraments could be celebrated there, nothing like that at all. It was sort of a punishment for all of them. There was a lot of excommunication at this time. One bishop would excommunicate another, and sometimes even kings would try to excommunicate each other. That's just how things worked. It was a little different in the Middle Ages, we might say. But papal authority was very strong at this point. And it continued even as there was a lot of political movements throughout the day. So eventually the Pope gathered or took over what were called the Papal States. So these were little kingdoms in Italy outside of Rome, a good hunk of Italy that the Pope became the political leader of. So not just the spiritual leader, the Pope became the political leader. As I said, anytime you get politics involved, sometimes money, prestige, things get in the way. You might start handing off special offices to other family members, perhaps, your nephews, your nieces, whoever it might be. We call that nepotism, right? But it did happen in the history of the church, so we won't shy away from that. As time went on, of course, you would see continually some conflicts between church and state. And so as the separation of church and state came about, sometimes the conflicts would go away, sometimes conflicts would get boosted a little more. Now I want to fast forward to the First Vatican Council, which was in 1870. Now at this First Vatican Council, it was the declaration of papal infallibility. Anyone ever heard of that? Declaration of papal infallibility. The Pope is infallible when he makes a declaration of faith and morals. All right, so we've only had a couple of those. It's not when the Pope says, okay, everyone has to eat broccoli because it's good for you. You don't have to listen to what the Pope said, because it's not a declaration of faith or morals. But for instance, the declaration of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, Mary was conceived without sin, the dogma of the Assumption, that Mary was assumed into heaven, that we believe those and we give our assent to those by faith. Now those were exercises of the Pope's right to infallibility. Now as I said, in 1870, the Vatican Council, the First Vatican Council, met and decided on this. The Pope had a lot of authority. It was a peak of authority. So it was sort of like this. When you think about the model of hierarchy, the Pope is way up here, then you have cardinals, archbishops, bishops, priests, deacons, laity. And it's sort of like the weight presses down. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but that's the model that came out of that council. Okay? Now fast forward to the Second Vatican Council, which happened in the 60s. How many of you were around for the Second Vatican Council? Okay, I was not even a thought, so I don't want to make you feel more aged than you are. But you saw this shift from the thinking of the First Vatican Council, which really focused on papal infallibility. The Pope is higher than any of the other bishops, right? And oftentimes the bishops were kind of seen as jurisdictional heads over a certain diocese or of a certain area, right? So it was kind of a priest designated to be the head, the bishop of a certain area, but ultimately had to follow whatever direction came from Rome. In Vatican II, you had sort of a bit of a shift toward more of a collegial attitude in the church. So it wasn't simply this top-down model, but more of a collegial model. So it's not just the Pope, but the Pope in communion with the bishops. Sort of like a wheel. When you look at the wheel, you have the what do you call this piece in the middle? Okay, the hub. Sorry, I'm already having a hard time speaking English tonight. So you have the hub of a wheel. So this might represent the one who's in charge, the Pope. But a wheel is not a top-down model. There's no sort of weight that goes from the top down and presses down. Instead, you have the hub of a wheel that is connected on all parts to the outside. So an image that we might use to describe what happened at Vatican II was this emphasis on collegiality, that more of the bishops would have a greater amount of authority, more of collegiality with the Pope when they talk about matters of faith. So you might consider these spokes going out to all these bishops. They're working in communion with the Holy Father and not simply under his weight of authority. Okay? So this is what we've kind of been working with. In 1965, the Synod of Bishops was established. Now that is every couple of years, whenever there's a need in the church, a certain group of bishops goes to Rome. And the most recent one that we had, I'm blanking on this, but we've had one on the new evangelization, we've had one on marriage and family life. And then after each synod, the Pope writes an apostolic exhortation. So the recent one, Amoris Laetitia, came out after the Synod of Bishops on marriage and family. All right, and so that is all of the bishops working in communion with the Pope instead of under his authority. So as we see now, especially with Pope Francis, he's wanting to give more authority on the local level and not simply have it as a top-down model from Rome. Okay? So now I'm going to move on to the more basic structure, governing structure of the church from the ground up. Okay, so you always start at the parish level from the ground up. So here's our grassroots explanation. We have here in Michigan City, Queen of All Saints, St. Mary, St. Stan's, Notre Dame, and Sacred Heart Mission. Now, each parish has its own geographical territory. So each parish has a pastor or administrator who's basically exercising his own little fiefdom over this geographic area. So it's not just the church grounds itself or the church campus, but it's a geographic area within the town of Michigan City that he exercises this authority over, now over the Catholics in it. Okay, if you think of New Orleans, there are sections of the city, the neighborhoods are still called parishes, right? So that's sort of a holdover from their strongly French Catholic culture that it's according to whatever parish it was at the time. Now, the pastor has the authority over all that goes on in his parish, including the sacraments, marriage and baptism, and especially when it comes to outside priests. So while I have faculties to do priestly functions in the Diocese of Gary from the bishop, I still need to get the permission of whatever pastor is in charge of that parish. So for instance, as long as I'm on good terms with Father Kevin Huber, I can go to Queens and perform sacraments there. But I have to get his permission first. I can't just show up and do a baptism. I can't just show up and do a marriage there. I have to have his permission first. So hopefully nothing gets in the way of him saying yes to me being able to do that. Okay? Now, that's the parish level. One step above the parish level is the deanery level. Now, in bigger dioceses, you have what are called vicariates, basically another fancy word for a deanery. Now I have another map here. This is the map of our diocese, the Diocese of Gary. You see all 4 counties here: Lake, Porter, LaPorte, and Stark. Now there are 4 deaneries in our diocese. So one is LaPorte Stark, one is the Porter Deanery, one is the North Lake Deanery, and one is the South Lake Deanery. So each is headed up by its own dean. So the dean's job is to visit each priest in the diocese in his own deanery and to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to. Okay. Now I think each dean in our diocese gets like $50 a month extra for what he does. So that's a great, powerful position you have to look forward to. I'm really looking forward to becoming a dean. Then you have lots more meetings that you get to go to as well. So after the deanery level, you have the diocese. Now here is the Diocese of Gary, the small little section of Northwest Indiana, which is headed up by the bishop. And he has authority, really complete authority over the Catholics in this diocese. Not that Bishop Hine would pull out the hammer on any of us, but if something needed to be done, he has the authority to do that. Now we'll get into the diocesan positions a little bit later, who works at the pastoral center, who's in charge at the diocesan level. But we'll keep on our way up. So this is the diocesan level. Now next, we have what you call the provincial level. Each diocese is part of a larger ecclesiastical province. So we are in the ecclesiastical province of Indianapolis, which encompasses the whole state of Indiana. Each province has an archdiocese and other suffragan dioceses is what they're called. Our archdiocese is Indianapolis, and so we have the Diocese of Evansville, we have Diocese of Lafayette, we have Fort Wayne South Bend, and our own Diocese of Gary. Now, the Archbishop that we have, Archbishop Charles Thompson, because Cardinal Tobin, who was our former Archbishop, was sent out to New Jersey, so we received a new Archbishop, and he is called the Metropolitan of the province. So he is in charge, essentially, of this province here. Now, he doesn't have a ton of authority over Bishop Hine. Now, I don't think he can depose. I think in the old days, they probably could do that. If you were Metropolitan, you could probably get rid of a bad bishop in one of your other dioceses. But I don't know exactly what authority he has. He is essentially a sign of unity, chief shepherd of all of the Catholics throughout the state of Indiana. And he's the one who gets to wear that pallium. So each bishop gets to wear a mitre and have a crozier. The archbishop wears that wool pallium that sort of goes around his neck. It's made of lamb's wool, and that's a sign of his authority as a chief shepherd in the province. So this is called a province, right? After that, you have what is called a region. Now, a region doesn't really mean a whole lot here, but a region is more for organizational purposes, especially for when the bishops go on their ad limina visit to Rome to meet with the Pope every 5, 6, 7 years. Our region is Region 7, encompassing all the dioceses in Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. So all those bishops travel together over to Rome. Also, they all take a retreat together each year. They come up to Mundelein Seminary, right next to where I went to school. And so you put all your eggs in one basket up there. Hopefully nothing bad happens, right?
That's a bad place.
Okay. After that, you have what is called a National Bishops' Conference. Okay, so here is the map of Catholic Church in the United States. it's color-coded, which makes it a lot easier. So the different colors refer to different provinces. If you see the state of Indiana here, it's its own province. The state of Illinois is its own province. Their metropolitan is Cardinal Cupich. Wisconsin has its own. Some states, there are multiple states in one province. And so whoever the archbishop is, for instance, up here, the Archbishop of Portland, out here it'd be the Archbishop of San Francisco, here it'd be the Archbishop of Los Angeles. Whoever the archbishop is the provincial of that area. And then you see the finer lines which separate the given dioceses in the United States. Now I think in the United States, I didn't check exactly, but there's anywhere between 150 and 200 dioceses. I think there are just over maybe 40 archbishops, sitting archbishops in the United States, 40 provinces in the United States. Okay, so all of these are contained within what we call the governing body of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the National Bishops' Conference. Now, they don't have a lot of jurisdictional authority over individual bishops, but they put out a lot of documents, for instance, documents that deal specifically with the Church in the United States. For instance, voters' guides. I think we're all familiar with those, how to vote well according to Catholic principles. That's put out by the USCCB. Other things that deal with, for instance, poverty or racism or other issues that we're dealing with, the USCCB meets twice a year, and so they have different committees. It's a quasi-governing body. They exercise some authority. What Pope Francis is trying to do is to put a little bit more authority and jurisdiction on the national bishops' conferences. So it doesn't just simply come from the Vatican saying, no, you can't do that, or yes, you can do it. He wants to give more authority to the national bishops' conferences. So, as I said, the National Bishop Conference elects a president and a vice president. Usually the vice president gets elected the president the next time. So let's just kind of filter your way in. So their president is Cardinal DiNardo from Houston, and Vice President is Archbishop Jose Gomez from Los Angeles. Above this, you have what is called the Apostolic Nuncio to the United States. Each country gets its own Apostolic Nuncio, which is basically the papal ambassador to that country. Now, the Apostolic Nuncio serves in this capacity not just to the Catholic Church, but serves as the civil ambassador as well. So if the Vatican ambassador had to meet with the president, then that would be the papal nuncio. So that is Archbishop Christophe Pierre, who is the new papal representative to the United States. So he is in charge of making a lot of the bishops' appointments in the United States. So he wields quite a bit of authority over what goes on in the United States, because he gets to have a large part in appointing new bishops here in the U.S. Okay, very good. Moving on now, we will go into the hierarchy that is within the diocese. These will be relatively short sections here. First of all, in the diocese you have a bishop, right? And he exercises quite a bit of authority over the diocese. You have if you are a bigger diocese like Chicago, you have auxiliary bishops. They have like 6 or 7 of them. I don't know what they do. They have tons of confirmations. So if you're an auxiliary bishop, good luck. You're going to be doing this quite a bit. Because there are certain needs like confirmations practical needs that need to be done. But auxiliary bishops can serve in other diocesan capacities as well. In canon law, there are certain positions in the diocese that do strictly have certain levels of authority. For instance, you have the Vicar General, who is sort of the number 2 to the bishop. In our diocese, the Vicar General to Bishop Hying is Father Brian Chadwick. So if Bishop Hying if something ever happened to him, or if, for instance, he was sick for a couple weeks after his trip to Europe, and I was just at a confirmation last week, and we weren't sure if the bishop was going to be there. So what do you do for a confirmation when you don't have a bishop? Well, sometimes the Vicar General can step into that role. He exercises authority when it is delegated to him from the bishop. So the vicar general could do things like that, like confirmations, or make those big diocesan decisions that need to be done. Because he has that canonical authority. In the laws of the church, the vicar general has quite a bit of authority. Then you have episcopal vicars. We don't have any of those in our diocese because we're kind of small, but in bigger dioceses, they might exercise certain authority over a certain region within the diocese. Then you have a judicial vicar, which takes care of a lot of the judicial process. So whatever judicial decisions have to be made in the diocese, they deal with those things. Canonical decisions, especially when it comes to marriage cases, that tends to be the biggest load that gets put on the desk of the judicial vicar. You might have a moderator of the curia, so that's a person who is in charge of sort of the chief of staff of the pastoral center. All of our people working at the pastoral center are on the diocesan level, so they serve in that capacity to help out the parishes in the diocese for whatever we need. And some dioceses have a chancellor as well, and that can be occupied by a lay person and not just a priest. That's the hierarchy of the diocese. Now the hierarchy in the curia I'm not as familiar with, but I'm just going to name off a whole bunch of offices that they have in the papal curia at the Vatican. So the Pope is the sovereign of the state of Vatican City. So not only is he a spiritual head, he is a temporal leader for Vatican City state. So since he is a temporal leader, he could probably wage war on another country, but I don't know what you would do with 100 Swiss guards and the Vatican police. You might not be able to get very far with that. But he does exercise that authority. And from what I read, the Pope is the only absolute monarch remaining in Europe, meaning that he exercises this spiritual and this temporal authority over the Vatican City state. Now, there is a pontifical commission that sort of governs Vatican City. So the Pope can't do that. He's always traveling, doing other things. He has to take care of the spiritual needs of the church. So you have others who take care of the government of the Catholic Church in general, not just Vatican City, but the governance of the whole church. There are lots of secretariats, dicasteries, congregations, other councils that are needed. This is called the Roman Curia. Anytime you hear on the news Pope Francis castigating the Roman Curia or reforming the Roman Curia, he's trying to help them get their act together, maybe organize a little better, get out of complacency, who knows. So you have the Pontifical Commission for Vatican City State, this group of cardinals that takes care of the governance of the church, the temporal governance. So you have a president of that. You have a Secretary of State, so he goes and visits leaders of other nations. You have a Secretary for the Economy. You have a Secretary for Communications. You have a dicastery for the laity, family, and life. You have the dicastery for promoting integral human development. Both of these were instituted by Pope Francis just last year as new offices to oversee these important areas. You have the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the CDF, which is also a very high-ranking position. Used to be called the Inquisition, but don't let that term fool you. Inquisition doesn't mean I'm going to torture you until you recant, because that's sort of the only image that we get when we read certain things about the history of the church. An inquisition literally means an inquiry. You inquire about what someone believes, and then you try to get them, nudge them on the right path if they're teaching something that's against what the church is teaching or questionable. So you have the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Pope Benedict, Cardinal Ratzinger, occupied that position for about 25 years before he became Pope. So he was known as the Pope's Rottweiler because he was in charge of really defending the faith. So those are the ones who examine certain things that are in question in the church, certain doctrinal issues, and his job was to defend the faith. You have a Congregation for Oriental Churches, so the ones in the East, Congregation for Divine Worship, Congregation for Clergy, which keeps the clergy's act together, make sure that nothing bad happens there. You have a Congregation for Bishops, which is in charge of the process for choosing bishops throughout the world. Congregation for Catholic Education. Then you have a couple tribunals, which are in charge of the judicial process. So when you think of the United States governmental process, you have the executive branch, legislative branch, and you have the judicial branch. So a similar thing is at work in the church here. You have the judicial branch, you have these tribunals, the Roman Rota, the Apostolic Signatura, which deals with judicial issues, the law of the church, canon law. It's not as big as civil law, but there are over 1,700 canons in canon law. So there's a lot that they have to deal with on a regular basis. You have the legislative branch, which sort of helps to carry out, or not carry out, but legislate certain laws in the church. You have the executive branch then, of course, which carries out those laws. Okay. As I said before, you have the Roman Church, you have the Roman Catholic Church, but you also have other Catholic churches that are not Roman Rite. If you've ever heard of the Melkite Catholic Church, or the Maronite Catholic Church, or Syrian Catholic Church, or Armenian Catholic Church, or Chaldean Catholic Church, all of these churches are united with Rome, they're in communion with the Pope, but they're not Roman Rite. They have their own liturgy, they have their own system of law in their church. They have their own patriarchs, so they have their own system of governance, but they're in communion with the Pope. They see him as their spiritual head. All right, so we're on to an important question that I have been asked recently. So when I was a seminarian, people would ask me what I wanted to do as a priest. Would I be teaching? Would I be doing administration? Or would I be working in a parish? The easy answer to that was, since I'm studying to be a parish priest, I would be essentially in a parish, hopefully for the rest of my priestly ministry. I would never want to work in a diocesan office because I don't like sitting at desks and doing work. I would much rather go over to the school and play at recess with the kids, which is what I've been taking advantage of. But one of the main questions that I would get, even as a seminarian, is, oh, well, would you ever want to work your way up to become a bishop? I thought, are you crazy? I'm not even a priest yet. Why are you asking me that question? And as a priest now, I can say, definitely not. I would never want to be a bishop, because then you get to deal with lawsuits, more and more of them. You get to deal with tons of meetings. You get to deal with perhaps troublesome priests, troublesome lay people. You get to deal with finances, confirmations. That's not a terrible thing, right? But you have to deal with a lot of things at the diocesan level that, fortunately, as parish priests, we don't have to deal with. Not only that, think of Bishop Hying, who was sent here totally out of the blue from Milwaukee. Had tons of friends up there, was very well established, a priest of Milwaukee, made auxiliary bishop up there. Then all of a sudden he gets a phone call from the Apostolic Nuncio. The Pope, the Holy Father, has appointed you Bishop of Gary. Do you accept? And we know the rest of the story. But the bottom line is, I don't know how much time he took. Maybe I need some more time, Your Excellency. But essentially, he's thrown into a new environment, doesn't know anybody, and probably has a stack of paper this thick on his desk waiting him. You need to take care of this stuff. So I would never want to be a bishop. But I will share with you sort of how you would work your way up in the church. And from what people have asked me, how do you become Pope? So here comes the fun process. All right? So in order to become Pope, you have to, first of all, be a man. Right? So, sorry, you have to be in the right half of the population. All right? But to be Pope, you don't necessarily have to be a cardinal or a bishop or even a priest. You just have to be a man who is Catholic. Okay, those are the two requirements, a Catholic man to be Pope. Now in all reality, it's very unlikely that you'll probably pick some 50-year-old layman out there and say, why don't you be Pope for us? Probably unlikely that that would happen. So here's the normal process for how you become pope. So let's say you're a young guy who's been thinking about the priesthood for a little while, or an older one who's thinking about the priesthood. You have to get accepted as a seminarian, right? So there's no such thing as a renegade priest. If you see one of those, that's bad news. Because you always have to be under the authority of some bishop or some superior if you're in a religious order. So you have to get accepted by a certain diocese in order to study to become a priest. So with my own case, I felt the call in college that the Lord was calling me to the priesthood. I went to the vocation director and he asked me a bunch of questions, went through psychological exam, figured out that everything was normal up here, and then the bishop and a bunch of other people had to get together and say, should we accept this young man to start studying to become a priest? Not that he's going to become a priest, but we're paying for most of his education, so let's not make a mistake here. All right? So you get accepted as a seminarian, and then you have to get accepted to a school to study to be a seminarian. Now, chances are likely, if you've been accepted by a diocese, you'll be accepted to a seminary. So you have to start studying. For me, I had to get an undergrad degree in philosophy, so that took a couple of years after I left Indiana University. You have to have a degree in philosophy, and then you have to go to a 4-year school for theology and get a degree in theology. So mine was a Master of Divinity, as well as an ecclesiastical degree, a baccalaureate in sacred theology. And then your bishop has to allow you to continue on your studies to eventually become a priest. So we had to write a bunch of letters to our bishop in order to become an instituted lector, a candidate for the priesthood, which means that you are really wanting to consider the priesthood. That was after a couple of years. Then to become a lector, an instituted lector, I had to write a letter. To become an instituted acolyte, I had to write a letter. To become a deacon, I had to write a letter. And then finally, to become a priest, I had to write another letter to the bishop. So it's just a long process of making sure that the bishop wants you to be his next priest. So it's like Uncle Sam. I want you to be a priest in my diocese. Okay, so you get ordained as a priest, and you're a fresh young priest who has not been jaded by a lot of the unfortunate experiences of parish life, and is willing to say yes to every speaking opportunity that he is offered. So hopefully he doesn't burn himself out anytime in the near future. But you're a young priest, and then you start off probably as a parochial vicar, associate pastor. After a few years, you might be sent to another parish to be an associate pastor. Now in our diocese, lots of the older guys are retiring at a pretty quick rate. And even though there are younger guys coming up in the pipeline, there was quite a bit of a gap where we didn't have many vocations. It was an unfortunate time in the past in this diocese. But the result of that is that younger guys are getting parishes of their own. So you become a pastor or an administrator, whatever your position is in that parish. You become a pastor, and let's say after a few years, I think you have to be at least 35 years old to become a bishop and be a priest ordained at least 5 years, something like that. I'm not sure exactly what the requirements are. You don't work your way up in the church. So that's what I have to tell people when they say, would you ever want to be a bishop? I say, first of all, no, because that's the worst work that you have to do. Secondly, even if I wanted to, chances are likely that wouldn't happen, because the more that you want to, the less probably that they want to make you a bishop, right? So ambition doesn't work well in the church. You're ambitious for the kingdom of God, but not for yourself. So you don't work your way up. Rather, it's a top-down process. So what happens is, let's say I'm a 53-year-old priest in a parish, and then let's say a lot of dioceses in the U.S. are vacant. They're looking for new bishops to replace these guys who have retired. You're mandated to retire at age 75. That's why Bishop Melchek had to retire at that age. You're looking for new bishops, and so what the Congregation for Bishops and what the Apostolic Nuncio to the United States does is they start sending out these recommendations to, let's say, bishops within a certain province or to priests in a given diocese, and they say, write down for us some names of priests that you think might make good bishops. And you have to fill out these long pages and pages of information about this priest. I already don't want to do that because it's a long process. So all this information is sent back to them, and then what happens is these bishops make these recommendations of what priests might be good to serve in the capacity as a bishop. And then ultimately it's this long process, and 3 names ultimately are given to the Pope, put on his desk. And then the Pope could say, eeny, meeny, miny, moe. If I was ever on that desk, he would never know who the heck I am. So he's ultimately relying on the advice of those closest to him. Like, we think this one would be a good one. The Pope rejects all of them. They have to restart the process. So as you can see, when a bishop retires, sometimes it takes a year, 2 years even, to replace him. That's because this is a very long process. Depending on how many times the Pope rejects it, chances are that's unlikely, but if he's like, I've seen him in the news, I do not want him to be a bishop. Okay? So sometimes that happens. So what happens is, the Pope accepts you, and you are appointed as bishop of whatever diocese. All of a sudden, let's say I am in a meeting, or I am at the school saying hi to the kids. I get a phone call one day from a number that I have never seen, that I don't recognize, and I pick it up, and it's a strong Italian accent. Hello, Father Edquist. The Holy Father has appointed you to be the next bishop of Timbuktu, God knows where. Do you accept? And so I could say, no. I could say yes, or I could say, can I think about it for a few days and get back to you? Okay. Most would say yes. Now, I think there was a practice in the Jesuits that if you were asked to become a bishop, you were expected to say no first time out of sort of a deference, out of humility. But if you were asked a second time, then that means the Pope really wants you. He might have made a mistake in letting you go through the first time, but if you get asked a second time, that you're kind of obligated to say yes. So you're made a bishop then. You say yes, you're made a bishop. Now that might be just a few days before this news comes out publicly. So it's posted on the Vatican website. It's made public to everyone. There's a news conference. So when Bishop Hying came to the Pastoral Center that November day, we got a notification the day before. There's a press conference at the Pastoral Center. Now everybody knew what that meant. They didn't say any names or anything, but we all knew, okay, we have a new bishop and he's going to be announced. So you get announced, and then a couple months later you're installed in that diocese. All right? So Bishop Hying, let's take him as an example. There are about 5,000 bishops in the world. There are about 400,000 priests in the world. 5,000 of those are bishops. So let's say Bishop Hying is on the fast track. He's, 53, 54 years old. He's pretty young. Hopefully we keep him for a while, but chances are unlikely that will happen. We all have our own way. So let's say Bishop Hying puts a sparkle in the eyes of a lot of other church leaders, and they say, we think he would be good to be the next bishop of, Cleveland or some other big diocese. Or he would be a good archbishop of, let's say, Indianapolis. Okay, so now he's working his way up the ladder. He could be appointed as archbishop there, or anywhere. They could send him anywhere in the whole country. So slowly working his way up. Now, the way it worked with Cardinal Tobin, he was Archbishop of Indianapolis. Indianapolis had never had a cardinal before, but Pope Francis really liked Archbishop Tobin. And so this next distinguished group of clerics in the church are what we call cardinals. So you are appointed personally by the Pope to be a cardinal, and you were in a sense made a cardinal. There are 200 of those in the world. Now Cardinal Tobin, because there's only about 200